trade agenda and deregulation, and we're beginning to see the effects of all of this in the data. And the first slide, if we can get it, is one of my favorite ways to just look at a summary of how the economy is doing is to look at the GDP growth over the previous year. And you might recall when President Trump ran for office and when he came in and when I first started at CEA almost a year ago, that we were looking ahead to 3% growth, and everybody said, no, 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 we've got a new normal, those blue lines which you see during the Obama years, where we've got growth in the ones, maybe up to 2 if we're lucky, but we could never get 3% growth again. Well, in the latest data that we have, we've got growth year over year that's just a smidgen less than 3%. And the Atlanta Fed GDP Now number right now is that second quarter GDP will be high enough to make the year over year growth about 3.1 or 3.2. And so if you look at this chart, you can see that there's been a clear trend break and that we've gone from a new normal of low growth to just normal, which is the 3% growth that Americans used to expect. Could I have the next slide, please? In this chart, I want to show something that we again talked about in the fall, which is that one of the reasons why we had such low growth in the previous administration is it was so anti-business, and it was basically discouraging capital formation in the U.S. with inappropriate tax policy and high regulation. And you can see that in the data if you look at, for example, the blue dot from Q1 2015 to Q4 2015, business capital spending barely increased at all. And even in pre-election 2016, it stayed at about the same level. But subsequently, after the election, already we started to see a big increase in business sentiment and capital spending started to go up. And now that we've passed the tax bill, then you can see capital spending skyrocketing just as we said it would last fall. And that higher capital spending is exactly one of the key factors driving growth at this time. I can remember way back in the fall saying that if we pass the tax bill, we'd expect to see capital spending this year higher by about 10%. If you look at the last bar in the first quarter of GDP this year, capital spending was up 9.2%. Next slide, please. There are a number of other things that we could look at, and believe me, we could go on all day, but I promised Sarah I'd stop at about 10 minutes. This is one of the ones that I find most striking because it has such a big impact on our outlook for small business. So right now, small businesses are as optimistic as we've ever seen since we've begun surveying them. And I think it's also interesting to see, like you can say, well, and sometimes people in the Obama administration will say, well, we just set this economy up for the president. But you can see a clear break in this chart at the election. And so President Trump promised that he would cut taxes, that he reduced taxes on small business, and that he would reduce the heavy regulatory costs that were imposed on them by the previous administration. And you can see even before he began to act, that sentiment turned around. I'd have the next slide, please. And that's helped lead to something that is really one of the more remarkable labor markets that we've ever seen. The job market right now is about as strong as I've ever seen. And there are a lot of different ways to put it in perspective, but for me, the easiest fact is just that it's only 7 times back to 1970 that we've had an unemployment rate below 4%, and 2 of those months were the last 2 months. And we expect that will continue. As remarkable as that chart is, I think the next one is one of the ones that I think moves me even more. The next chart shows the gap between the unemployment rate of white workers and black workers. And you can see that the gap between the unemployment rate for black workers and white workers has gone to an all-time low. And it's maybe about 1/3 what it was on average during the Obama administration. And of course, we want that gap to get all the way down to 0. But we've made a tremendous amount of progress because President Trump's are working to heat up the economy. The next chart for a person who loves economic data is really my favorite because you rarely ever see anything that is the best since the Second World War in economic data. And this chart shows that the initial claims for unemployment insurance, which is those people who have the really bad news that they lost their job and then show up at the unemployment office to collect their unemployment insurance, that as a share of the workforce, they're the lowest they've been since the Second World War. And so, really one of the worst, most disruptive things that can happen to a person's life is to lose their job. Right now, there's never been a better economy for this since the Second World War. I've got one more chart, and then we'll open up for questions. And the last chart is something that the president tweeted about, and this is just a chart of what's happened to Americans' wealth since the president was elected. This is how much money they've got in their checking accounts, their saving accounts, what the value of their house is, and of course the value of equity markets. And you can see that since the president was elected, that Americans' wealth has increased by $7 trillion. And I would guess that when we see the data over the next coming quarters, that we're going to cross the $100 trillion mark for Americans' wealth. And so it's very clear that the president's economic policies are working, but I think that the most important thing is that they're working for America's workers, that America's workers are being laid off at the lowest pace that we've ever seen, and wage growth, which we didn't include in the chart, is also taking off as well. With that, I'll